What's up, family? I want to thank you for being here at Jack Hakimian TV. And I want to talk to you about Robert Lee Vann. He was born in 1879 and he died in 1940. Now, you probably have never heard of this individual, but he was probably the most influential person that shaped the black political thought of this era. Okay, this information, I'm going to put it on the YouTube channel, on the YouTube page. I'm gonna have a link there that takes you to blackpast.org, which tells us a little bit about this huge historical figure. But again, you probably haven't heard much about him because black Democrats don't like talking about him. And you're going to see why. I'm just going to read to you a few paragraphs from this historical encyclopedia. Robert Lee Vann, newspaper publisher, politician, government official, and civil rights leader, was born on August 27, 1879 in Ahoskie, North Carolina. He graduated as valedictorian of Waters Training School in Winton, North Carolina in 1901 and attended Wayland Academy in Richmond, Virginia between 1901 and 1903. Vann was influenced by John T. Mitchell, editor of the Richmond Planet, who was adamantly opposed to Jim Crow laws and disfranchisement. Vann was a regular contributor to the school newspaper, and by his senior year, he became editor-in-chief. He attended Western University of Pennsylvania in Pittsburgh and graduated from its law school in June 1909. He passed the Pennsylvania bar exam on December 18, 1909. Initially, Vann worked as counsel for the Pittsburgh Courier, a newspaper organized by a small group of blacks, in March 1910. By 1912, Vann had sole control and became editor of the newspaper. Within a few years, he developed the Courier into one of the leading African American newspapers of the early 20th century. Circulation steadily climbed, reaching 50,000 by 1920 and 174,000 by 1936. By 1930, the newspaper was sold coast to coast, and at that point was the largest black newspaper in circulation in the nation. Vann's newspaper grew popular because of its opposition to the demeaning duties assigned to the black soldiers during World War I. In the 1920s, Vann also began to cover the rise of the first national black sports heroes such as Jesse Owens and Joe Louis, and in the process built a huge readership. And this is where it gets interesting. Vann was also active in politics, initially as a Republican. He served as national director of Negro publicity in the Republican presidential campaigns of Warren Harding in 1920, Calvin Coolidge in 1924, and Herbert Hoover in 1928. By 1932, however, he became a Democrat and helped Franklin Roosevelt win black votes in 1932. Vann was rewarded by Roosevelt, who appointed him assistant to the Attorney General in 1933, a position he held until January 1936. Vann's support for Roosevelt and the New Deal influenced thousands of black voters to move into the New Deal coalition. Over 80% of African American voters supported Franklin Roosevelt's re-election in 1936. Vann, however, eventually became disenchanted with the New Deal, and in 1940 supported Republican presidential nominee Wendell Willkie. Robert Vann never lived long enough to see Franklin Roosevelt elected to a third term with overwhelming African American support. He died of cancer in Philadelphia on October 24th, 1940. So here is one of the most powerful influencers of the black migration into the Democratic Party, who realized that Franklin Roosevelt's promise of the New Deal was a farce. It was really a New Deal for white supremacists within the Democratic Party. It wasn't a New Deal or anything different for blacks. And he did what many blacks have been doing and are still doing, migrating back to the Republican Party. Again, I'm not a Republican. I'm an independent kingdom commentator and activist. For me, it's about Jesus Christ and the Word of God. But as I observe policies and I observe behavior, I'm recognizing that historically, Republicans have been better. They're not excellent. They're not perfect. They've been better. Meaning, in their policies when it comes to biblical justice. You do your own research. Look at Robert Lee Vann. Look at the 1964 Civil Rights Act. 2/3 of the House and Senate were all Republicans. Many of the Democrats were against it. And people say, oh, all those racist Democrats became Republican. Like, why would they become Republican? Republicans had just voted for the 1964 Act. MLK was a Republican. In fact, they hated the Republicans. And this was the party that had made a deal 30 years previous with Robert Lee Vann. They promised them government care. You would have thought by now these Democrats would have been progressive, but they weren't. They made promises to control the vote. And when you study the history of black urban communities, Oakland, Overtown here in Miami, South Central, Watts, Compton, Detroit, Chicago, you can go back to this New Deal. Really, I would say the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The communities have gotten worse and worse under local democratic political control, while conservative areas have gotten better through free market principles of business and trade, competition. This is what Malcolm X was talking about. We don't need the government. We don't need other people. Conservative Christian preachers were saying the same thing. All we need is freedom. All we need is the right to integrate, the right to access, which is what the Republicans in the 1964 Act voted. President Johnson would have never been able to pass that. He didn't want to pass it. He was very reluctant to pass it. But the question is, when did the so-called Democrats become Republicans and Republicans become Democrats? Why would the Republicans even want to become Democrats? When did the shift happen? Folks, I'll submit to you, there was never a shift. But there was a shift of methodology. And you know what that shift was? The Democrats realized that we can, like President Johnson, we can continue to make promises and not necessarily have to deliver, because they can't, right? Section 8 is not going to take people out of poverty. Welfare is not going to take people out of poverty. The only thing that takes people out of poverty is innovation, self-reliance, self-control, God, faithfulness, skill sets in which you can compete. Elected officials, all they are is like referees. They can't play the game. They can just ref. They make policies that allow us to have justice, which is what the Republican Party has been doing since Lincoln. Now, do the Republicans have baggage within their party? Absolutely. Do they have racists? Yeah, there was Northern Republican racists, but it was a different type of racism, right? It's a different type of expression of racism. Think about it. Just think about it.